The bell in Dry Hollow rang slow that day, the kind of sound that stops a man mid-stride and makes him look to the sky. Inside the town chapel, the air was thick with dust and sorrow. Every pew was filled. Women dabbed their eyes with handkerchiefs. Men stared at the floorboards, hats held over their hearts. At the front of it all stood Martha Ellsworth, a woman carved from prairie granite, holding her little girl's hand. Lucille was only 4 years old. She didn't understand what a funeral was, not really. But she knew the long wooden box in front of her was wrong. It felt cold. It felt empty. And it was where they had put her papa. Lucille pointed a tiny finger at the coffin. "Papa," she whispered, her voice a feather in the heavy silence. "Papa's talking." A few heads lifted. Folks exchanged pitying glances. Grief does strange things to a child's mind, they figured. But Lucille wasn't just talking. She was listening. She tugged on her mother's black dress, her eyes wide and certain. "He's calling me, Mama. He's calling me from in there." The room went dead still. The preacher, who had been about to speak, let his Bible fall shut. Every single eye in that church was now fixed on the little girl, and the coffin she was pointing to. Martha bent down, her face a mask of control. "Shh, baby," she murmured, trying to smooth her daughter's hair. But Lucille pulled away, her little body trembling with an urgency no one understood. "He's stuck, Mama," she insisted, her voice rising. "He's scared." Martha Ellsworth froze. Her hand, hidden in the folds of her dress, tightened around the cold, dead weight in her pocket. It was Samuel's silver pocket watch. It had stopped ticking at 2:47 p.m., the exact moment he had collapsed near the barn. She hadn't been able to wind it since. It was as if time itself had died with him. But she carried it anyway, a silent, useless piece of a life that was gone forever. Or was it? A low groan echoed through the chapel as the heavy wooden doors swung open. A man stood silhouetted against the blinding Arizona sun. Henry McGraw, Samuel's cousin. He was dressed in a fine dark suit, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He walked down the aisle with the quiet confidence of a man who believed the world owed him something. His presence brought a chill into the sweltering room. He stopped beside Martha, his voice a low, sympathetic murmur. "Cousin, you must be exhausted." Martha didn't look at him. Her eyes were still locked on the coffin. Henry's gaze followed hers. "We're all broken up about Samuel, a strong man, gone too soon." Then he leaned closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "I know this is a terrible time, but that land Samuel held, it's going to bring nothing but trouble, debts, lawyers. For Lucille's sake, it might be best to let it go. I can take care of it for you." 2 days. It had only been 2 days since her husband's heart had supposedly given out, and here was Henry, at his funeral, talking about land. The same land he and Samuel had fought over for years, the same land Henry believed should have been his. A bitter grudge, born from a failed cattle venture and a broken promise, had festered between them like a wound that wouldn't heal. It had turned them from brothers into strangers, separated by barbed wire. Martha's jaw tightened. Lucille tugged on her dress again, her voice a desperate, tear-filled whisper. "Papa says don't let him take it, Mama." Martha's breath hitched. The coffin sat there, silent and still. But the air in the church had changed. It was thick now, heavy with something more than just grief. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Little Lucille wouldn't let go. Her small fingers were like a vice on her mother's leg, her gaze fixed on that terrible wooden box. "He says it's dark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He can't move." Martha didn't reply. She couldn't. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, was spreading through her chest. It was a mother's instinct, an animal sense that tells you when a predator is near, even when it's smiling at you in a house of God. Her fingers found the silver watch in her pocket again. She could see Samuel winding it, clear as day, the morning he collapsed. A ritual, a promise of another day. The watch hadn't ticked since, but right now, in this suffocating silence, she needed to believe it could. She needed to believe time wasn't over. Whispers started to ripple through the pews. "She keeps saying he's alive," one man murmured. "Poor child doesn't understand death," a woman replied. An old widow, Rosalind Baxter, her face a road map of hard years, leaned toward her neighbor. "Children see things we refuse to," she said, her voice low but clear, "especially when love ties them to the other side." The preacher cleared his throat, trying to bring order back to his flock. He lifted his Bible, but his words were just empty sounds in the charged air. Martha crouched down, her eyes level with her daughter's. "What else, Lucy? What else do you hear?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lucille's eyes welled with fresh tears. "He says it's cold. He says he can't breathe." The walls of the church seemed to press in, and then, without warning, the doors creaked open again. This time, it wasn't a vulture like Henry. It was Marshal Matthew Boone. His coat was caked with trail dust, his boots were worn, and his revolver sat low and heavy on his hip. But his face wasn't the face of a lawman there to keep the peace. It was the face of a friend, and it was filled with a terrible urgency. He took off his hat as he walked toward Martha. "Came as soon as I heard," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of authority. "But there's something you need to know." Boone was a man of few words. Folks in Dry Hollow said he could smell a lie from a mile away. He never had to raise his voice. He'd once stared down a lynch mob with nothing but the cold certainty in his eyes. His justice wasn't loud. It was inevitable. Martha turned to face him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Before Samuel passed," the marshal continued, his eyes flicking for a moment to Henry, "he came to me. He said Henry was pressuring him hard about that land. Said he'd never sell. Told me that straight." Martha's blood ran cold. "And then 2 days later," she whispered, "he was dead." Boone gave a single grim nod. Before anyone could say another word, Lucille's voice cut through the silence, sharp and clear. "He's crying now, Mama." The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. Martha shot to her feet. A collective gasp went through the church. The preacher froze, his mouth half open. Every single person turned to stare at the coffin. And then it happened. A soft, muffled sound from within. Thump, a woman screamed. Someone dropped a prayer book, its pages scattering across the floorboards. Thump louder this time, more urgent. Martha staggered back, a hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror she had never known. Lucille grabbed her dress, her small voice filled with a desperate triumph. "He's calling your name, Mama!" The chapel was no longer a place of mourning. It was a tomb, and something inside was trying to get out, for what felt like an eternity. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The sound had been real. A knocking from inside a sealed coffin, not once, not twice, but a steady, deliberate rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. Martha was frozen, the world tilting on its axis. The mourners around her were backing away, their faces pale masks of fear and disbelief. The preacher was muttering a prayer, his hands trembling. Lucille's small hand was still balled up in her mother's coat, right over the silent silver watch. That watch. That terrible, silent watch. It was as if all of time was holding its breath, waiting for this moment. Then a woman's voice, raw and shaky, rose from the back of the chapel. "This ain't right. The child said he was alive, and now we all hear it." A man by the door crossed himself, his eyes wide. "It's a spirit, trapped, begging to be freed." Marshal Boone took a step forward, his voice cutting through the rising panic like a knife. "That ain't no spirit," he said, his gaze hard as desert rock. That's a man still drawing breath. Boone was not a man given to flights of fancy. He'd seen the worst of what men could do to each other. He didn't spook easy, but the way he placed one steady hand on the lid of that coffin told everyone in the room that he knew something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Just then, the chapel doors burst open for a third time. A man stumbled in, panting, his coat torn, his face streaked with dust and sweat. It was Doc Esteban Garcia, the traveling physician who saw to the folks in the outlying territories. He was waving a crumpled piece of paper, his eyes wild with alarm. "Don't open that coffin!" he yelled, his voice cracking. A fresh wave of gasps and murmurs went through the room. Martha stepped toward him, her voice tight with a strange mix of hope and terror. "Why not?" The doctor finally caught his breath, his eyes darting from Martha to the wooden box. "I looked over the certificate," he said, his voice shaking. "The one pronouncing Samuel Ellsworth dead. It's signed by a doctor I've never heard of. And I've been practicing in this territory for 15 years. The name isn't registered anywhere. Not here, not in Tombstone. It's a ghost." Boone's eyes narrowed. "You're saying there was no legal confirmation of death?" "No autopsy," Garcia confirmed, his face grim. "No hospital record. Nothing. Just a piece of paper, signed by a phantom." The crowd was in turmoil now. People were pressing against the walls, trying to get away from the coffin at the center of it all. Widow Baxter's face was as white as a sheet. Then, a voice cut through the chaos. It was raw, defensive, and cracking under the pressure. "This is madness!" Henry McGraw stepped forward, his whole body trembling. "You're all listening to a hysterical child, to superstition. He's dead. The man is gone." But his words had no power. No one was listening to him anymore. They were listening to the sound from the box. Boone stared at Henry, a long, unnerving silence stretching between them. "Then you won't mind if we open it," Boone said, his voice flat. Henry's hand twitched. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. Martha moved toward him, her voice low and dangerous. "Why are you so afraid, Henry?" He stammered, words failing him. I'm just—" Thump, thump, thump. The knocking came again, louder, angrier, desperate. Henry went pale. Lucille pointed her tiny, unwavering finger right at him. "He says Henry is a bad man, Mama. He says he's scared of him." From across the room, Widow Baxter's voice rose, trembling but firm. "Open the box. Whatever's in there, living or dead, it has a right to be let out." Martha placed her hand firmly on the coffin's lid. Marshal Boone moved to her side, his hand now resting on the butt of his gun. And in that moment, Henry McGraw finally broke. Henry scrambled backward, his face a mess of sweat and panic. The confident man who had walked in minutes ago was gone. In his place was a cornered animal. Marshal Boone's eyes were like chips of ice. "You got something to say, Henry?" The entire church was watching, waiting. Henry's mouth opened and closed, but only a choked sound came out. Then, as Boone and Martha prepared to lift the lid, he did something that sealed his fate. He lunged forward. "No!" he shrieked, his voice ragged with terror. "You can't! It's disrespectful to the dead!" Boone was quicker. He grabbed Henry's arm in a steel grip, twisting it behind his back with a practiced, brutal efficiency. "I don't reckon you know the first thing about respect," Boone snarled, his voice low and cold. "Not when you're trying to stop a wife from reaching her husband." Henry struggled, but it was useless. Martha stepped away from the coffin, turning to face the man who had called himself family. Her voice was no longer a mother's cry, but a blade. "You drugged him, didn't you?" The room fell into a silence so deep you could hear your own blood pounding in your ears. Henry froze in Boone's grip, and then something inside him just snapped. His shoulders slumped, his knees gave out, and a single wretched whisper escaped his lips. "I didn't mean to kill him." A shockwave of gasps and horrified cries went through the chapel. It hadn't always been like this. Henry and Samuel had been boys together, fishing in the same creek, dreaming under the same vast sky. But Samuel had built a life on honesty and hard work. Henry had always wanted a shortcut. When Samuel inherited the larger share of the family land and married Martha, something in Henry curdled. It was a poison he'd been sipping for years. Now, on his knees, the poison was pouring out. "I just wanted the land," he sobbed, the words tumbling out in a broken rush. "With the railroad coming through, it's worth a fortune. He wouldn't sell. He said he'd die before he gave it up." He sank completely to the floor, a broken man at the foot of his own crime. "So I slipped something in his drink, just to make him sleep, just so he'd sign the papers. That's all I wanted." Martha's voice cracked. "But he didn't wake up." Henry nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I panicked. I bribed the undertaker. I paid a stranger to sign the certificate. I thought maybe he really was dead." "You thought?" Boone's voice was lethal. "I didn't check," Henry wailed. "I was too scared to look. I just wanted it to be over." Martha's fists clenched, her knuckles white. "You put him in that box. Alive." Henry couldn't look at her. He could only stare at the floorboards, at the ruin of his life. And then it came. Bang, bang, bang. 3 thunderous pounds from inside the coffin. A sound of pure, desperate rage. Lucille shrieked. Martha fell to her knees beside the box, her composure finally shattering. "Samuel!" she cried, her hands flat against the lid, as if she could push her love right through the wood. "Hold on! I'm here!" Marshal Boone stood over them all, his voice ringing out with absolute command. "Reverend, Doctor, get ready! We're opening it! Now!" Henry let out a strangled, inhuman cry. "No! Don't!" But his voice was lost in the wind. No one was listening to him anymore. They were only listening to the man in the box. Martha knelt by the coffin, her hands trembling as she felt the wood vibrate with the life trapped inside. Every beat of her heart was a hammer blow against her ribs. Marshal Boone stood over her, his sleeves rolled up, his face set like stone. An old rancher named James Harlan, a friend of Samuel's, stepped forward, his silence speaking volumes. He was here to help. Lucille clung to her mother, her little voice a constant, desperate prayer. "He's waiting, Mama. He's scared. Please hurry." The Reverend Elias Thorne finally found his purpose. He stepped closer, Bible held tight in one hand, the other raised to the heavens. "Lord," he intoned, his voice shaking but clear, "if there is a soul still lingering in this vessel, grant us the strength to set it free." Boone and James looked at each other. They nodded once. Together they gripped the edge of the lid and pulled. The wood groaned in protest. The seal broke with a sickening crack. Martha held her breath. The dim lantern light of the chapel spilled into the dark interior. And there he was, Samuel Ellsworth. He was pale as death, his lips cracked, his clothes askew. But he was breathing. Weak, shallow breaths, but they were breaths of life. His eyes fluttered open. They were confused, hazy, blinking against a light he must have thought he'd never see again. A ragged gasp escaped his throat, the sound of a man clawing his way back from the abyss. "Martha!" Her name was a broken whisper. A sob tore from Martha's throat. "Samuel! Oh, dear God, Samuel! You're alive!" She threw herself over him, her hands on his face, his hair, her tears washing the dust from his skin. She kissed his forehead, his cheeks, his hands, as if she could erase the tomb with her love. As Boone and James carefully helped Samuel sit up, lifting him from the coffin, Lucille launched herself at him, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "Papa!" she sobbed into his shoulder. "I heard you! I told them you were talking!" Samuel could barely speak. but he wrapped a trembling arm around his daughter. His eyes, those clear, kind eyes, were filled with tears. He had heard her. Through the wood, through the darkness, through the suffocating fear. He had heard the voice of his little girl, and it had been his anchor. Martha reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the silver watch. She pressed it into his hand. His fingers, weak but determined, curled around it. The Reverend stepped back, making the sign of the cross. "It's a miracle," he breathed. But Marshal Boone wasn't looking at the miracle. He was looking at Henry McGraw, who was still kneeling on the floor, his face a twisted mask of horror and disbelief. "It's not possible," Henry mumbled. "He was dead. He had to be." Boone walked over to him, each footstep a final, damning judgment. His hand rested on the butt of his revolver. "You buried a man alive, McGraw. You lied to his family. You tried to steal his life, all for a piece of dirt." Henry trembled. "I didn't know. I thought you didn't care," Boone finished, his voice cold enough to freeze fire. Suddenly, the sound of thundering hooves and shouting men came from outside. The chapel doors swung open with a bang. Sheriff Elijah Granger stood there, broad-shouldered and quiet-eyed. He was the law in Dry Hollow, a man who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He polished his badge not for show, but to remind himself of the promise it represented. He knew evil didn't always shout. Most of the time it whispered. He took one look at Samuel, alive and breathing, being held by his wife and daughter. Then he looked at the open coffin, and then at Henry McGraw on the floor. His face hardened into a mask of grim understanding. He looked at Boone. "I served in the war," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Saw men buried who shouldn't have been. Never thought I'd see it happen in my own town." He turned his steel-eyed gaze on Henry. "Take him," he ordered his deputies. They moved fast. Henry didn't fight. He just wept, his shoulders shaking as they hauled him to his feet and led him away into the dying light. The nightmare was over, or so they thought. In the days that followed, a fragile peace settled over the Ellsworth homestead. Samuel was weak, but he was alive. He spent his days on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching Lucille play in the yard, a look of quiet disbelief on his face. He was a man relearning the simple beauty of sunlight and fresh air. But something was still wrong. He couldn't remember everything from those lost hours. It was all a dark, confusing fog. He remembered the strange, bitter taste of the whiskey Henry had given him. He remembered his legs feeling heavy, the world tilting, and he remembered something else. A voice, not just Henry's. There was a third man in the room with them before he collapsed. He couldn't remember a face, just a low, cultured voice talking about railroad timetables and something called the Red Creek Mine. He told Martha, he told Marshal Boone. The detail seemed insignificant, but Boone was a man who believed there were no insignificant details, only overlooked ones. The night after Samuel was rescued, while the town was still reeling from the shock, Martha was cleaning the suit he had been buried in. She was about to burn it, to erase the memory of the grave from her house forever. But as she held the coat, her fingers brushed against the cuff. There was a strange stain on the dark wool, a fine reddish dust, almost like rust. It wasn't the soil from their land. Theirs was a pale, sandy brown. This was a deep, angry red. She showed it to Boone. He took a pinch between his fingers, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Red Creek Mine," he said softly, more to himself than to her. "It's been abandoned for years. The soil out there is red as blood." A new, cold thread of fear began to weave itself around Martha's heart. This wasn't just about Henry's greed. Henry was a fool, a coward. He wasn't smart enough to plan all of this. The forged death certificate, the phantom doctor. This was something bigger. Henry was a pawn. But who was the king? The next morning, without a word to anyone but Martha, Marshal Boone saddled his horse. He told her to keep her rifle loaded and her doors locked. Then he rode out towards the red hills, alone, chasing the ghost of a voice and the stain of red dust. He was no longer just a friend helping a family. He was a hunter, and he had caught a fresh scent. Back in Dry Hollow, Sheriff Granger was growing uneasy. He had Henry McGraw locked up tight, but the man's story was full of holes. He claimed he found a traveling doctor on the road, a man he'd never met before, and paid him $20 to sign the certificate. He said the undertaker, a nervous man named Silas Croft, asked no questions. It was too neat, too simple. Granger decided to pay Mr. Croft a visit. He found the undertaker packing a suitcase in a hurry, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fold a shirt. "Leaving town, Silas?" Granger asked, his large frame filling the doorway of the small shop. Croft jumped, dropping the suitcase. "Sheriff, I was just visiting my sister in Flagstaff." Granger didn't smile. "Your sister died of fever last winter, Silas. I was at the funeral, remember?" The color drained from the undertaker's face. He knew he was caught, and in that moment the carefully constructed wall of lies began to crumble. Because out at the Red Creek mine, Marshal Boone had just found something that was going to blow this whole conspiracy wide open. He kicked open the door to the old mine office. Inside, he found discarded vials, a half-empty bottle of a strange-smelling chemical, and a burn barrel filled with charred paper. But one page had survived. It was a ledger, and on it was a list of names: the Phantom Doctor, Silas Croft, the Undertaker, and at the bottom, next to a large payment sum, were the initials S.B. Boone had just put a name to the ghost. And that's when he heard the click of a rifle hammer being pulled back behind him. Two men stepped out of the shadows of the mine shaft, their faces hard, their eyes empty. "The marshal should have stayed in town," one of them rasped. A gunshot echoed through the silent red hills, and back in Dry Hollow, the undertaker finally broke. He told Sheriff Granger everything. He told him about the money, the threats, the man who had orchestrated the entire plan. A man with more money and power than anyone in the territory. A man who wanted Samuel Ellsworth's land for the railroad, and who wouldn't let a single life stand in his way. His name was Silas Blackwood. "He's not just going to let this go," Croft sobbed, his face buried in his hands. "He knows the plan failed. He'll want to clean up the mess." A sudden, terrible realization dawned on Granger's face. "The Ellsworths," he breathed. The mess wasn't Henry, or Croft, or the Phantom Doctor. The mess was the family that had survived, and Blackwood's men were already on their way to clean it up. Dusk was settling over the Ellsworth homestead, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Inside, the lamps were lit. Martha was holding a shotgun, her hands steady, her face grim. Samuel, still weak but filled with a fierce new strength, stood by the window with his own rifle. Lucille was hidden in the root cellar, told it was a game of hide and seek. They knew they were in danger. After Boone had ridden out, a sixth sense, the instinct of survivors, had told them the fight wasn't over. They didn't know how right they were. The first sign of trouble was the silence. The crickets stopped chirping. The night birds went quiet. An unnatural stillness fell over their land. Then a shadow moved at the edge of the tree line. Then another. There were 4 of them, moving low and fast, armed with rifles, their faces hidden by the growing darkness. They weren't here to talk. They were here to finish a job. Samuel raised his rifle, his knuckles white. "Martha," he said, his voice low, "stay away from the windows." A floorboard creaked on the porch. One of them was already at the door. Martha's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She thought of Lucille hidden in the dark below. She would not let them reach her child. She would burn this house to the ground first. The doorknob began to turn, slow and silent. Samuel aimed his rifle, the barrel unwavering. This was it. the final stand. And then, from the darkness behind the attackers, a voice boomed out. "Drop your weapons! This is Sheriff Granger!" Gunfire erupted from all directions. It wasn't just Granger. He had a posse of deputies with him, appearing like ghosts from the night, their guns spitting fire. Blackwood's men were caught completely by surprise, pinned down between the house and the law. The quiet homestead turned into a war zone. Samuel and Martha fired from the windows, adding to the chaos. One of the hired guns went down, then another. The remaining two broke and ran for the darkness of the trees, but another figure emerged from the shadows to block their path. He was limping, his arm in a makeshift sling, but the revolver in his good hand was steady. It was Marshal Boone. He had dealt with his own ambush at the mine, and he had come back to finish the fight. The two remaining thugs threw down their guns and raised their hands. It was over. The silence that returned was filled with the smell of gunpowder and the ragged breathing of brave men. Sheriff Granger walked up to the porch, his face streaked with grime. He nodded at Samuel. "Glad we got here in time." Boone limped up beside him. He looked at Martha. "You were right to be worried." He held up the charred ledger page. This is what they were willing to kill for. But the real prize wasn't the hired guns now tied up and bleeding in the dirt. It was the man who had sent them, and Boone knew exactly where to find him. On a private rail car, parked on a siding at the edge of town, Silas Blackwood was pouring himself a glass of expensive whiskey. He was a man dressed in a fine suit, his hands soft, his face accustomed to getting what he wanted. He believed himself to be untouchable. He was wrong. The door to his rail car slid open. Blackwood looked up, annoyed at the interruption. Standing there were Sheriff Granger and Marshal Boone, their faces hard, their guns drawn. Blackwood's smile was slick with arrogance. "Gentlemen, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Boone tossed the ledger page onto the polished table. "It's over, Blackwood." The railroad baron's eyes flicked to the paper, and for the first time, a flicker of fear crossed his face. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said, trying to regain his composure. "You have no proof." Granger stepped forward. "I've got the sworn confessions of your undertaker and your two hired guns out at the mine. And the two you just sent to murder a family are singing like canaries." Blackwood paled. He reached for his whiskey, his hand trembling slightly. "My lawyers will have me out of this by morning," he sneered. Boone shook his head. "Not this time. This time the truth got out of the ground before you could bury it for good." He stepped forward and slapped a pair of iron handcuffs on the table. The sound echoed in the luxurious rail car like a death knell. The untouchable man had finally been touched, and justice, which had started with the whisper of a 4-year-old girl, had finally found its voice. The trial was the biggest thing Dry Hollow had ever seen. It wasn't just Henry McGraw, the fool, or Silas Blackwood, the monster. It was their whole network. The phantom doctor they'd found cowering in a saloon in Tombstone. The hired guns, the undertaker. The courtroom was packed every day. People came from all over the territory to witness the story that had become a legend. The story of the man who came back from the grave. Samuel Ellsworth took the stand. He wasn't a victim anymore. He stood tall, his voice clear and strong. He leaned on a cane, but it seemed more like a scepter than a crutch. He held up his silver pocket watch for the whole room to see. It was ticking, steady, loud, alive. He looked directly at Silas Blackwood. "That man," he said, his voice ringing with a power that shook the room, "believes that land is worth more than a life. He believes a man's future can be bought and sold and buried if it gets in his way." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the jury, the judge, the packed gallery. "He wanted my land to build his railroad, but he forgot something. You don't build a future on top of dead men's bones. You build it with family. You build it with honesty. You build it with the love of a wife who won't give up and the faith of a child who can hear you, even when the whole world thinks you're silent. He didn't ask for revenge. He didn't have to. The truth was its own verdict. The judge's gavel came down like thunder. 25 years of hard labor for Henry McGraw. Life for Silas Blackwood and his hired killers. Yuma Territorial Prison would be their new home, a place where the sun was merciless and the walls were high. Justice had been served. As the courtroom cleared, Marshal Boone slipped out a side door. He was already thinking about his next stop, some water rights dispute down south. His work here was done. Sheriff Granger stayed behind, polishing his badge, a quiet, satisfied look on his face. The law had bent, but it hadn't broken. 1 month later, dawn broke over the Ellsworth homestead. The world was quiet, washed clean. Samuel sat on the porch, a mug of coffee in his hands, a blanket over his knees. The darkness was gone from his eyes. He watched the world like a man who had been given a second chance to read his favorite book. Martha sat beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. Her heart was finally at peace. And in the yard, laughing as she chased butterflies, was Lucille. The sunlight seemed to catch in her hair, turning it to gold. She was the sound of their new beginning. Samuel opened his palm. The silver watch lay there, ticking away the moments of their beautiful, ordinary, miraculous life. Lucille ran up the steps and climbed into his lap. "Why does it tick now, Papa?" she asked, her small fingers tracing the hands of the watch. Samuel smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Because your mama never stopped believing it would." Martha leaned in, kissing them both. "And because you never stopped listening." They sat there together, the three of them, as the sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the shadows. Out here in the harsh desert, it's easy to think a story is over when the dirt is shoveled onto a coffin. But sometimes, a love that's stronger than death, and a little girl's voice that's truer than any lie, can make time itself start over again. It was a powerful reminder that the most important things in life aren't the land you own or the money you have, but the voices you refuse to let go of in the dark. What do you think is the strongest bond a person can have? If you enjoyed this story of a family that refused to be broken, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice from the shadows.